A Chief Constable at Dumfries and Galloway, at Lothian and Borders, and then you go to the other side, in a sense, Inspector of Prisons. And what do you notice different? Has your perspective changed in the criminal justice system?
Well, I wouldn't describe prisons as the other side, in that both policing and prisons play a really important part in the criminal justice system. And what I see as a common aim from both services, which is about preventing crime, reducing the number of victims of crime, making Scotland a safer place. They approach it from a different angle, but I think there's unity in wanting to contribute to making Scotland safer and to reduce the potential victims of crime.
Was your experience different from? Did you get a different sense of how it should change or how it should be dealt with, or were both your police experience, your chief inspector experience coming to the same place? You've said that they were, but there must be a difference in perspective.
Yes, absolutely. As a chief constable, I was responsible for delivering policing services, latterly in Lothian and Borders Police, in charge of an organisation of 4,000 people, trying to prevent crime, working in partnership with communities. Moving to be Chief Inspector of Prisons was different. So, first of all, it was prisons and not policing. But I think more importantly, my job is one of scrutiny and oversight. So I'm not responsible for delivering prison services. That's the Scottish Prison Service. But I'm responsible for inspecting and monitoring the conditions in prison and the treatment of prisoners, of those in prison. And so my approach is very much looking at the experience of someone in prison, and I'm particularly interested in what is the impact of someone serving a sentence. So what happens at the end of the sentence when they leave and return to their community? Are they less likely to reoffend? What work's been done in prison with them so that they can return and reintegrate successfully into society rather than returning to a life of crime, which sadly so many of them still do. We'll
come to rehabilitation in a moment, but within the prisons you noticed a high level of mental health problems, of addiction in prisons. That must be challenging.
I think that's a real challenge for those running prisons. In every prison, the single topic that people in prison raise with the independent prison monitors who go in every week and with inspectors is the provision of health care. And I think people from the outside will be really shocked at the levels of poor health in prisons, particularly amongst prisoners who are serving short sentences, high levels of mental health problems, high levels of addictions, whether alcohol or drugs, and then chronic conditions. We're seeing more and more older prisoners, people who are perhaps convicted later in life or serving longer sentences. I produced a report last year called Who Cares?, which was about the experience of older prisoners. And some of them have really high social care needs and dementia and so on. So that whole issue about healthcare is a really prominent one in prisons.
Very briefly, what about we hear it time and time again from chief inspectors of prisons, putting people into jail for short sentences doesn't work. Briefly on that point.
I was a member of the Scottish Prisons Commission that produced the report Scotland's Choice 10 years ago. We were arguing that there should be fewer short sentences. The evidence is that a short sentence in a way does more harm than good, particularly in the longer term. People who serve short sentences, the evidence shows that when they're released, 2/3 of them are likely to be reconvicted within 2 years. It disrupts family life. If someone's got a job, they might lose it. If they've got a tenancy, they might lose their flat. And so there's a lot of damage that is done for not much good at all.
We'll continue the conversation shortly, David, but some of the challenges faced by convicted prisoners transitioning from jail to the outside world are being addressed in a new scheme involving the Scottish Government, businesses and charities. The service Release Scotland is designed to be a one-stop shop for employers looking for help in recruiting people with a criminal record. This report comes from Ivana Holland.
Chris McConkie served 6 months in jail for an assault conviction. But during his time in prison, he saw a chance to turn his life around and sought employment.
I was really looking to try and come back out and get into work as soon as possible, which is not easy with any conviction, especially one that's unspent, because it's so recent. And I think it was maybe the first 5 or 6 jobs were positive until we found out my situation. So I feel there's a lot of discriminated against a lot because of it.
Release Scotland wants to tackle that discrimination and preconceived ideas about those with criminal records that they're unsuitable for employment. More than a third of adult men in Scotland have a previous conviction in their past. For women, that statistic is at 9%. But 3/4 of UK companies say they wouldn't consider hiring someone with a criminal record.
The idea is that Release Scotland will show that big employers such as Virgin Trains, Greggs, Marriott's, Timson's, they all have found employing people with convictions to be great members of their staff, great members of their team, and they haven't found themselves being stigmatised or having their reputation tarnished.
The initiative is being backed by the Scottish Prison Service as a measure to avoid reoffending and help contribute to society.
First of all, it's an economic imperative. It is providing us with access to labour market and an untapped pool of talent that we desperately need to grow our businesses here in Scotland.
The new body is calling on more employers to give convicts a second chance.
We'll return to David Strang, the Chief Inspector of Prisons. Release Scotland, you were talking about rehabilitation, so how significant is something like that?
I think support for people leaving prison is hugely significant, and I think at the heart of this question is whether you believe that someone can change. Some people in society are very judgmental and think that if someone has committed a serious offence and gone to prison, that they're written off. And the Scottish Prison Service has a great strapline which is unlocking potential, transforming lives. Just those simple 4 words, unlocking potential, transforming lives. And that's based on a belief that people can be transformed, people can transform their lives and produce better outcomes. Now, it won't work for everybody, but it is worth investing in preparation for release and particularly employment. There are a lot of barriers for people when they leave prison. People still walk out of the doors of a prison without accommodation, and sometimes they're put in unsuitable accommodation like hostels or bed and breakfast. If they have addiction problems, they need to register with a GP and they need to claim benefits. And that's before they even think about getting a job. So something like Release Scotland and initiatives to support people leaving prison to be able to get a job, I think is hugely important.
But there is quite a strong public perception that, you know, if you don't do the crime, you wouldn't have to do the time and you get whatever's coming to you. Particularly, you were talking about, previously about short-term sentences. Are you sympathetic, or can you at least understand that public view that if people have committed a crime, they go into jail and they suffer for it?
But the price that they pay is the prison sentence, and that's absolutely right. And prison is for people who have particularly committed serious crime and pose a threat to society. So I'm not arguing that people shouldn't be sent to prison, and in some cases for a long time, because that is appropriate. But when someone has served their sentence, that is the punishment that was required by the court. And we should do all we can to help them start again, have a second chance and have a clean sheet. Now, the stigma is very strong, that people are very judgmental. And I do understand that. If I was an employer and you've got 2 people who are suitable and one's been in prison, I can understand why you'd be more likely to offer it to the person who hasn't, because you might think the other person will be dishonest or not as a hard worker. So there are barriers that we put up. We say to people that you should change your ways, get a job, be a responsible citizen, and yet we put barriers up, such as the fact they have to declare their convictions and make it more difficult for them to get a job.
So, in the broader sense, what should prisons be for, do you think?
Well, prisons are to protect the public. That's the fundamental purpose of imprisonment. And prisons detain people who are sentenced by the court, and they're sentenced by the court as a consequence of their crime. So if people have committed serious crimes and continue to pose a threat to society, we need to protect future victims, and therefore prisons should be a place of detention for people who have committed offences to protect the public. And then while they're in prison, work should be done with people in prison, however long, whether they're in for 4 years or 14 years. Work should be done with them to prepare them for release. So, I mean, there are shockingly high levels of poor literacy or low levels of literacy and numeracy. So if people need education or skills training, and there are lots of really good initiatives going on in prisons in Scotland in terms of education, in terms of arts, and so in terms of skills training. People can get qualifications to work on a building site, they can do recycling, and just learning skills that will help them when they're released to get a job. But there are also some much more basic things, like many people in prison don't know how to cook, how to manage a budget. So those things that you and I would take for granted as simple life skills, again, if people can be taught those and encouraged through their prison sentence, then they're more likely, when they leave prison, to be able to maintain their own tenancy and live a successful life.
How big is the drug problem in jails, and is it changing over the years?
Well, the drug problem, as you describe, is linked to people's addictions. People in prison, more than half of them say that they were drunk at the time of committing the offence. So, I mean, levels of addictions, whether alcohol or drugs, are high. I was inspecting a prison recently, and nearly half of the people in prison were getting a daily prescription for medication. So that gives a kind of level of the health problems and the need for drugs. What we have been finding...
But illicit drugs as well, though, that's presumably prescription, but what about illicit drugs?
Well, we've been finding, particularly in our recent inspections, increasing concerns about new psychoactive substances. So these are unknown substances that they used to be referred to as legal highs, where there's a chemical composition that's unknown, and because of that it has an unpredictable impact on the person. Psychoactive substance means that it changes their brains, changes how they behave, and certainly both prisoners and staff have said to us that they're concerned about the unpredictability. People who take them can behave in very bizarre and strange ways. They can be very violent. And then often when they come down, they don't remember what they've been done. So I think this is an increasing problem across Scotland, and the prison service needs to tackle that in conjunction with the health service.
You're coming to the end of 5 years. There's some positives you've seen, positive changes over that period.
Yes, one of the positives is that the number of people in prison is less than it was. There are fewer people in prison. 6 years ago, there were about 8,200. Today, there are just over 7,500.
And is that because crime's falling? Is that because of sentencing?
Crime is falling, but young people particularly are out of prison. About 6 years ago, there were over 1,000 people in the system. Now there are about 300 young men under 21. So I find that hugely encouraging. The quality of accommodation has increased significantly. Most prisons have been built in the last 20 years. There are still 4 old Victorian ones that need to be replaced, but accommodation, and I would say the quality of relationships between staff and prisoners is absolutely key, as people are supported in preparation for release and then after release.
David Strang, thanks for joining us in Scotland.
Thank you very much indeed.